Welcome into the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Brandon Kravitz here along with Nick Whalen. On today's pod, we will discuss injuries that are ravaging your roster. We'll take a wide view of the MVP race, which I know is only down to two players, but I have a question that I have to throw Nick's way about that and some potential playoff matchups as well. Nick, we are back. Whenever we end up with this sort of gap week where you and I don't connect, I feel like I haven't talked to you in a month. So what's new?
The fact that we did not have a pod last week, totally my fault, because my body had once again betrayed me. Anybody who's listened to our pods this week has heard a lot of coughing. You know, I'm trying to lean away from the mic as if it's not going to pick it up, and it totally does every single time. But yeah, I was dealing with a bit of an illness, and then had to hop over to New Orleans for the weekend for a bachelor party, which was fantastic. But tell you what,
still able to enjoy yourself even though you were down for the count?
Yeah, I made the most of it. It was, it was one that I definitely wasn't going to miss. But there was a lot of looking myself in the mirror throughout the weekend of like, was this a good idea? Probably not. But I'm glad I went. I can finally confirm that the number one way to not recover from being sick is to go drink 40 beers with the boys down in New Orleans. But we're on the mend. We're on the mend.
You don't know until you do it, you know. So
yeah, right. It could have gone either way.
You bit the bullet for us. Consider it a science experiment,
yes.
If anything else. You can continue to light us up with your questions in the comment section, and we'll get to those to wrap today's episode as we do. Were you able to catch any of that Bucks-Pacers game last night? If I know you were, but who knows? You're in recovery mode, so I don't know when you're sleeping these days. But Tyrese Halliburton with the sideways fadeaway three, and then Giannis gets called with a foul that I do not agree with. I understand letter of the law, whatever. He was obviously trying to defend the play and not getting in Tyrese Halliburton's landing space, but really exciting finish to that one between two teams that we might end up seeing in round one.
Yeah, it's starting to feel like that could certainly be a 4-5 matchup in the Eastern Conference. And we'll talk about the bigger picture for both of these teams, specifically Milwaukee, in a bit. But I didn't think that was a foul at the end, to be honest. Yeah, they spent a lot of time reviewing whether or not Halliburton's foot was in bounds, and it was just kind of assumed that it was a foul. And Giannis initially kind of pushed back a little bit, but I guess he didn't really mount the kind of defense that you would expect if he truly didn't touch him. But either way, it goes without saying, you just can't foul in that situation. But more than anything, just an insane shot from Tyrese Halliburton. I mean, over the outstretched arms of Giannis, he's kind of on the move, catching that one, almost like a jet sweep essentially along the sideline, and just kind of one of those 1 in 1,000 type of shots. But it's just kind of been that kind of year for the Milwaukee Bucks. You feel like you have the game iced. Dame goes and hits 2 free throws. You're up 3. You're going to cover the 2. Everything's looking good. And just the one thing you can't give up there is a decent look from 3. I don't even know if that qualified as a decent look, but an incredible shot by Halliburton. Both of these teams needed that game too, because the Pacers had lost 3 in a row, 2 to Atlanta, 1 to Chicago, with Tyrese Halliburton out of the lineup. And Milwaukee has now dropped 3 in a row. All of them you could say are excusable losses, but what I texted my Bucks fan buddies last night after that game is that it's just starting to feel like Milwaukee doesn't have that next gear. And obviously we've seen this team come up short in the postseason many times over the last 6 or 7 years, but there's always been some sort of excuse. Usually it's been related to Giannis's health. But the one thing that team always did do was cleaned up in the regular season. I mean, the Bucks were a wagon in the regular season, even when they weren't winning titles. And they just don't look like that team anymore. I thought Giannis was really passive, didn't come back into the game until midway through the fourth quarter. And he has just completely owned the Pacers really for the last 5 years. And just, put up a nice stat line, had a big rebounding night, but it wasn't what you're used to, when Giannis takes on the Indiana Pacers, where it's just head down, getting to the rim. He's putting up 45. Thought he was a little too passive. And, Damian Lillard continues to have a really nice season. He was an all-star, no question about it. But I still don't think you're getting that top level Damian Lillard production that you thought you were getting coming back into last year. And this has been going on for almost 2 full seasons now, where he'll give you 25, 6 and 6, but it's like you want more nights where it just feels like this is Dame's team, and it still feels like he's a little bit too deferential. He just doesn't quite have the same impact on the game that he did when he was running the show in Portland. So you can't cross off Milwaukee. There's still a case to be made that they could have the best player in any series in the Eastern Conference. I think they have a path to potentially, maybe you could try to topple Cleveland or Boston in round 2, but they're not going to be favored in either of those series. And it's just getting harder and harder for me to see the path. I mean, Boston and Cleveland are deeper. They're better, in terms of if you stack up their top 4 or 5 guys at the top. And I don't think Milwaukee has a level to go up right now in the playoffs.
And I think to your point about the pairing of Giannis and Damian Lillard, the end of that game is a good example of Damian Lillard just kind of fading too much into the background. You have 3 seconds left. Giannis tries to run the floor in 3 seconds, which to his credit, he almost did.
I know. I almost wanted him to keep going because he ended up pulling up for that runner 3.
But if you have 3 seconds and you're going to take a shot that has to be somewhere near half court, you got a guy who can make that routinely. There was a whole game show about this during the All-Star game. Hey, can you hit one before Damian Lillard hits 3? I didn't understand that at all. But that goes back to the deferral to Giannis as the guy. It's bizarre because this team clearly has enough talent offensively to be one of the elite teams in the NBA. That kind of goes without saying. Giannis, Damian Lillard, now they have Kyle Kuzma. When you look at their defensive rating on the season, they're a top 10 team. Usually teams that are as talented as the Milwaukee Bucks are offensively, that are top 10 in defense, you feel more confident in them going into the postseason. So it does feel like, hey, you're always going to have Giannis in whatever series you're in, but the consistency and quality night after night that you are getting from teams like Cleveland and like Boston does give you some pause. And, I put everything through the Orlando Magic filter. The Magic just beat this team the other night. The Magic can't beat anybody. They're losing to the Raptors and Bulls like it's nothing. That is definitely problematic for Milwaukee.
They're losing to the Raptors when the Raptors are outwardly trying to lose a game,
Correct.
And there's just something about you watch Milwaukee late game and you don't feel confident. You don't feel confident in the coaching staff. You don't feel confident in the personnel. And, I think coming into the year, I certainly viewed Boston as on a higher tier. I would have said New York was on a higher tier slightly than the Milwaukee Bucks. I don't know. I think I would have said Cleveland was probably closer to that 3 or 4 range. They've surprised everybody. But as the season goes along, it really feels to me like Milwaukee is closer to Indiana and Detroit than it is Boston and Cleveland. And I know that's a high bar. We're talking about a 55-10 Cavaliers team. But even if you told me, coming into the season, hey, the Bucks could be the 3 or the 4 seed, there's going to be a big gap between them and the teams at the top, I would say, yeah, I could see that. It's probably Boston leading the East, not Cleveland, but whatever. I would have at least told you, though, hey, I think Milwaukee can ratchet it up in the playoffs. And I don't feel like they have that extra gear. I really don't. It's hard. It's almost unfathomable for me to picture them going on the road against Boston or Cleveland and winning one of those series.
Well, let's just stick with that first round then, because it looks like we got a preview. Things still could change. There is some bunching up that is going on right now between the 4 and the 6 seed in the Eastern Conference. Milwaukee at the 4 and Detroit at the 6, and they are all pretty much neck and neck when it comes to win percentage. Right, yeah, so one thing that I know that I'd be betting on with Milwaukee playing Indiana in round 1 is that the series would go to 7. That would be the first bet that I would make. But do you even like Milwaukee to get out of the first round in this situation?
With a healthy Giannis, I do. That I can only be so negative here. I still think you give a healthy Giannis for a 7-game series if is what it goes. I would take Milwaukee over Indy. I would take Milwaukee over Detroit. Now, if the Bucks were to fall to the 6, which is very realistic, and you're playing New York in round 1, and the first 2 games of that series are at MSG, and they have a healthy Jalen Brunson, that to me becomes a little bit dicier, right? I think trying to avoid that 6 seed and getting, in theory, the easier matchup within that 3-game or 3-team pod, Milwaukee, Indy, and Detroit, that should be the priority. But the problem for Milwaukee, unlike a team like Detroit, for instance, like Detroit winning a first round series, like let's say the 4-5 is Indy Detroit, and Detroit wins that. I mean, that's like a monumental win, right? I mean, that is a massively successful season. It's the most successful season that the Pistons have had in a decade plus. Milwaukee just winning in round 1 and, getting gentlemen swept by Cleveland or Boston in round 2, that's not a success at all. And it's just starting to feel like that's becoming an inevitability, whether they get out of round 1 or not. This is a team that has different goals than the other teams that we're comparing them to right now in Indy and Detroit.
Yeah, and to be clear about why this is happening, in my opinion, I'm curious where you fall on this. They are too dependent on their 2 stars. I know they tried to get out of this a little bit with adding Kuzma, but it feels like it's all the offense is all on Giannis and then all on Damian Lillard. And if one of them goes cold for even a little, then then the team goes sideways. And when you're comparing them against those top dogs in the Eastern Conference, their top players can have an off quarter and those teams will stay afloat. I think that's the difference between, and they're a little bit better defensively, but it's not like Milwaukee has been a bad defense on the course of the season.
No, the Bucks have been a very good defense, and that's sustained since the All-Star break. I mean, they're number 4 in defensive rating. They're not all that far behind the top 2 defenses, the Lakers and the Cavs. So we're talking about an 11-game sample. Like defensively, I think Milwaukee is just fine. They've come a long way, but with Dame Giannis in the starting lineup, you can't be the 15th best offense in the NBA after the All-Star break. You know, I think that's the issue. Like you can't be sitting in the middle of the pack when you have those 2 guys on the court. I will say Giannis is basically averaging like 32 minutes per game since the All-Star break. So that number will go up. You know, I think they are kind of managing that calf injury on the fly. And I'm not a huge believer in doing that. You know, it's like, is there really that big of a difference between playing 32 and 33 minutes versus 35, 36? Maybe there is. I'm sure they've done their research on that medical staff, but I think that will help, you know, because when you get into a first round playoff series, we're going to see Giannis playing 38, 39, 40 minutes.
While we're on the potential 4-5 matchup, I want to flip over to the West because this is one that if it holds, I'm going to have a really hard time picking. So I kind of want to get my mind wrapped around it now. The Memphis Grizzlies would have the home court advantage against the Houston Rockets, 2 teams that I don't think any of us trust come playoff time. But if they meet in round 1, somebody is going to advance to round 2. That's the way this thing works in the NBA. So do you trust that Memphis has been really bad defensively? But they have the linchpin star. Usually, if you're going to go with that old adage of just take the best player in the series when all things are equal, you would go with Memphis because Ja is the bucket guy that you trust the most in that series. But Houston has the defense that I want to side with. I like both coaches a lot. Taylor Jenkins, Ime Udoka. I'm a little twisted up with that potential series if we end up with it.
I'm skeptical of anybody who could sit here right now and say, like, this is who would win that series and this is how many games it'll go. Dude, I have no idea. And I hope we get this series. You know, we'll see if Golden State ends up staying hot. I mean, I think they're 3 back right now of the 5 seed. So totally conceivable that the Warriors could work their way into that 3, 4, 5 discussion if they keep playing like they have. But I hope we get this matchup. You know, for one, I think that would potentially give us Golden State and the Lakers or Golden State and the Nuggets in round 1, which would be fantastic. I think I'm with you. I would side with the overall defensive prowess of the Rockets more than I would this, you know, Memphis ability to seemingly put up 135 whenever they want. I mean, both these teams are really deep. You know, both of them have kind of groomed these role players who've had to play more minutes over the last couple of years than they probably want due to injuries. And now they're ready to be contributors. You're totally right about the coaching on both sides. I think we might have 2 of the 5 or 6 best coaches in the NBA, you know, especially when you're talking about teams that don't have one of those absolute premier talents. But you're right. I mean, it's an interesting matchup because Memphis does have the guy offensively in Ja Morant, and they'll likely have a healthy Jaren Jackson back at that point. But is there a team in the NBA that has more dudes to throw at Ja Morant, to throw at Jaren Jackson? I mean, Houston just has guy after guy after guy with length, with athleticism, with youth. You know, they have corner shooting. It feels weird to say this. It could kind of hinge on Fred VanVleet. You know, like what kind of stretch is Fred VanVleet in that series? Because we've seen Houston struggle to generate good shots without him. But then you look at Fred VanVleet's numbers and you're like, okay, he's shooting like 38% from the field. He's still prone to those nights where he goes 1 of 8 from 3. It's like, how many of those do you get over the course of a series? But would be a fascinating matchup. You know, this unstoppable Memphis offense, run and gun versus a Houston team that does want to slow it down. And I think is certainly better defensively.
I tend to lean towards Memphis because I trust a team's ability to ratchet up their defense come the playoffs a little bit more than I trust the team to be able to hit another gear offensively because defense is so effort driven. We got a good question here. I'm going to fit this one in here before we get to the official question portion. Speaking of Memphis, any ear on the ground, any intel on Jaren Jackson Jr.'s progress in his return?
There hasn't been
anything
too much.
pop up.
It hasn't been too much. You know, I think they've essentially kind of softly ruled him out through the end of the week. You know, we haven't really been getting like game by game updates on him. So I think the expectation is that he'll miss the rest of this week, which is 3 more games. Could be back as early as sometime next week. They're at Sacramento on Monday, at Portland on Wednesday, at the Clippers on Friday. It's a 5-game road trip that goes all the way until March 27th, which not ideal because sometimes, you know, if a player is still hurt mid road trip. They don't like to fly him out there and meet the team. So it could be something where if they do want to play it safe, they would wait till the end of that road trip. Then we're talking March 29th. But I mean, Jaren Jackson was at least on the floor with the team during shoot around over the weekend. So somewhat of a good sign, I suppose. But no, I haven't really heard anything in terms of a firm timetable. Trying to think what did they initially say? I mean, they basically just said he was week to week right away, grade 2 ankle sprain. So
Yeah.
I would expect.
And he's been participating in shoot-arounds too. That's usually a sign that a player is close to returning. This might be more precautionary at this point.
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I would say plan on 3 more games at least for Triple J.
Well, some other news out there. Thunder head coach Mark Daigneault said that Jalen Williams does not have a timetable to return. The Thunder are deep, but this is a tough one to cover up. They got a big one tonight. I think for most of you listening to this game probably has already transpired.
Right.
But the live audience curious about how this one's going to go. The Thunder taking on the Boston Celtics. That's the big game on the Wednesday night slate. So I will need a pick on this game, by the way, but how do you think the Thunder are able to manage, and then who becomes fantasy viable with Jalen Williams out?
Yeah, the old no timetable, not what we want to see for Jalen Williams at this point in the season. And he's a guy who's been really healthy throughout his Thunder career. I think he missed like 11 games last year. A couple of those were rest related at the end of the season. And we've only had 3 games this year where he has not played and SGA has played. But SGA sees about a 6% usage rate bump in those games. So I think the easy answer is just more SGA first and foremost. I know his points, rebounds, assists tonight is 46.5 against the Boston Celtics. I would take the over. I would. SGA tends to ratchet it up for these big games. He did go pretty well under that PRA number in all 3 of the previous games without Jalen Williams, but all 3 were 25 plus point wins for OKC. He was averaging like under 30 minutes per game in those, so I wouldn't read too much into that. But you're right. I mean, OKC is deep, right? I mean, this is kind of more of a showcase now, I think, over these next couple of weeks, specifically for Aaron Wiggins. I think he's the guy that I'm most intrigued by here because Isaiah Joe, we kind of know what he is. He's somewhat of a 3-point specialist. Lou Dort is just out there to be a fullback. Obviously Caruso, can hit the corner threes and he plays defense as well. But Wiggins is kind of the piece to me that could do a little bit more for this Thunder team. So if you are in a shallower league and he's out there, he's somebody I would look into.
Yeah, we've seen some explosions from him this season as well. I wanted to be on the Oklahoma City Thunder, but what got me off of it is that I'm looking at the Boston Celtics recently, and it just seems like they are in flip the switch mode, and I have a really hard time fading Boston at home when they have decided that the season now matters.
Yeah.
When the Lakers came to town, they said, that's adorable the way that you've been playing. They dominated them pretty much the entire way through. I think this could be one of those games. If OKC was fully healthy, I would be on OKC. I also think that if you're getting it now, you're getting the worst of the number because this was +4 last night, and it's down to +2 the last time that I checked. It feels like Boston is the right side. I like the over in the game. I like did the RotoWire pick video, which you can find on all RotoWire social channels. SGA, really, that's where most of my money is in this game is Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, points total over. The Boston Celtics are really good defensively. They don't care all that much about protecting the paint. They really want to stop shooters on the outside. And Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is basically he's a sharp knife as far as getting through to the paint at will. I think in that pick and roll, they're not going to be able to stop him. And this could be a big 40-point night for Shai, no matter the result of the game.
I think it's going to have to be for OKC to hang around, right? I think if you think the Thunder have a chance to win this game, if you think it's close late in the fourth quarter, it's pretty hard to imagine SGA, not putting up like 44, 8-8 to keep them in this. I mean, OKC does have plenty of depth. We talk about that all the time, but I mean, Jalen Williams is a tough piece for them to lose, right? It's like, I would argue that outside of SGA, he's probably the most difficult to replace. And that includes Chet Holmgren, right? I mean, we saw this team play really well without Chet for basically the entire first half of the season. Even for a while, they were doing that without Isaiah Hartenstein and were able to kind of patchwork it. But, I think the jump down from SGA to Jalen Williams is big, but then from Jalen Williams to this collection of role players is also pretty huge. I think a lot of those role players, you miss one of those guys for a week or two, you can just kind of call somebody else up. But all of a sudden asking Aaron Wiggins, like, hey, gonna need 20 and 5 out of you tonight.
Yeah.
There's not many nights he's been asked to do that, but obviously should expect more to Chet Holmgren as well. I think that's the other piece. I think we focus so much on him working his way back from injury, and we haven't really cared about the numbers all that much, but this is going to have to be his time over these next couple of weeks.
I have an MVP question that I want to ask you. We've got listeners that are lighting us up in the comments section. We'll get to the bounce to wrap today's episode, but you, my friend, have a very important message for us about our partners at Edge Boost and PoolGenius.
I do. So yeah, we'll start with Edge Boost. Have you ever had your debit card declined or had to call your bank at 3 a.m. in Vegas? The answer is no for me, but I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who've been in this situation. Well, if you have, Edge Boost is the first consumer-facing online bank dedicated to the gaming industry. There are a ton of benefits to using Edge Boost, including $250K per day in debit deposits, unlimited withdrawals. If you deposit $25, you get $25. You can get cash back on sports betting, DFS, sweeps, 100% approval for all gaming activities. You don't got to worry about that. Financial segmentation for discretion and responsible gaming. It's compatible for predictions markets, iCasino, DFS, sports betting, lottery, brick and mortar casinos, horse racing, and sweeps. No transaction reviews or account freezes. So you can visit edgeboost.bet. Do it right now and use our promo code ROTOPOD. That's ROTOPOD over at edgeboost.bet. We're also brought to you by PoolGenius, and it's a good time to talk about PoolGenius, Brandon, because we got March Madness coming up. We got some big golf tournaments, TPC this weekend. So you want to win more in those golf or March Madness pools. Well, PoolGenius gives you data-driven picks and strategies to outsmart the competition. With over a decade of analytics and historical data, PoolGenius is the only site dedicated exclusively to helping you win sports pools. With PoolGenius, users win 3 times more often than expected. And RotoWire listeners get exclusive offers right now at PoolGenius. Just go to poolgenius.com/RotoWire, up to 55% off, or you could just start a 4-day free trial. That's poolgenius.com/RotoWire.
So this question may be foolish, but I think it's worth asking the question because I think we have entered into a stage of collective media groupthink, where there are only 2 MVP candidates, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Nikola Jokic.
Correct.
And you look at this from an odds perspective, obviously those 2 should be at the top of the odds list. I still think that we are at a portion of the season, and there are enough great players in the league where we should be having a more involved conversation about who the MVP is.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem like that is the case. It is Shai, it is Jokic, and no one else is even discussed. Is that fair? Or is should we be adding a 3rd or 4th name to the discussion? Almost like it's the Heisman race. Let's invite 4, even if we kind of know who's going to win.
Well, I mean, who's to say it's a 2-man race, right? I mean, I think if you want to extend it to a 3rd and a 4th, you can. But is there any argument that SGA and Jokic are not kind of on their own tier of this discussion? As much as I respect what LeBron is doing, what Donovan Mitchell's doing, Giannis, Jason Tatum, whoever you want to throw into that mix, like, I mean, if we want to put together a top 4 and we want to invite everybody to, some sort of ceremony where 2 guys have to sit there knowing they have no chance, that's fine. I think there's a line of demarcation this year, right? I think if anything, where I thought you were going with this is, should there be more Nikola Jokic love? You look at the odds right now, SGA -475, Jokic +310. Then we got a huge drop off to, LeBron and Tatum and Giannis, who are like 500 to 1. I think that's fair. I think that's totally fair. I mean, this truly feels like a 2-man race to me.
Yeah, and it does feel that way, but I also think that has become the narrative. And sometimes the narrative becomes so all-consuming for sports fans, sports media, that we end up forgetting that the impact that some other players are having on their respective teams. Giannis is the number 2 player in terms of points per game. He's a better defensive player than Nikola Jokic is. And if you want to play the game of let's take him off the team, what exactly do you think would happen to the Milwaukee Bucks without Giannis? If you've watched any Bucks games this year, you know that team is competitive when he's on the floor, and the second he hits the bench, they have problems. He reeks MVP, and yet it's not discussed. Jason Tatum, who doesn't have the Boston Celtics potentially going to the NBA Finals?
Yeah.
The consistency, the dynamic of knocking down threes, playing consistently on defense. They're the best team on the floor anytime they play against anybody. And Jason Tatum, you go back to that game, they are a different team when he's not out on the floor. I think these guys should be more involved in the conversation, even if the conversation ends with, yeah, but they're probably not going to win. We have eliminated too many names from the MVP discussion. I don't know if I'm being a complete socialist with this MVP vote, but I just feel like I needed this PSA. We end up in these bubbles where we only talk about two players when all these other guys are making these tremendous impacts.
I mean, that's all well and good, but people want to talk about who's going to win the award, not who's going to finish third or fourth or fifth. Maybe there should be more discussion about that. Maybe it should matter more if you have a top 5 MVP finish. It is essentially reduced to, did you win it or did you not win it? Nobody cares how many times you finished in second. I get that, but look, as much as I love Jason Tatum, the advanced numbers just don't compare. They just don't compare to what SGA and what Jokic are putting up. And, Giannis is in that neighborhood. If you just want to look at some of the basics in terms of, BPM and VORP and PER and things like that. But there's even a step up, from Giannis to Jokic and SGA. Look, I'm sitting here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I would love for Giannis to win another MVP. But what is the narrative for Giannis right now? Other than, if you take him away, the team is bad. You could say the same thing for SGA. You could say the same thing for Nikola Jokic. And it's not like the Bucks are sitting there with 52 wins right now either, right? It's like,
which, by the way, I personally, was one of my sports pet peeves is when people try and make it an argument for a player to be an MVP by simply saying if you took them away. That's not how you should vote for MVP. But so many people, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate with my own argument because I just wanted to bring it to light. I just wanted to at least shine a light on the fact that no one is talking about anybody else but two players, and it bugs me. Even if my argument for it isn't great, I still think there's merit for, can we get other players in the discussion?
If the Bucks were a better team, I think there would be some Giannis hype. There would, but they're not good enough. They're not good enough, right?
And that's why I think you have to throw, okay, well then maybe it's Tatum that should be in that discussion.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, if anything, I would rather vote for Donovan Mitchell. I think, right?
Donovan Mitchell.
There's an 8-game difference between the Cavs and the Celtics, and that's really the only path for
best
someone
team,
like
best
Tatum
player. What's the difference? I know. I mean, I understand that Shea's numbers are better, but if we're saying that that's part of the reasoning here, then then he should be. Sure, let's throw him in there.
Well, Thunder have 53 wins, man. They're only 2 games behind the Cavs for best record. I don't know. The way I look at MVP, I don't really like to value team record all that much. Obviously, if you're on like a 25 win team, you're not going to be in the mix. But it's who's the best player in the league. And to me, the argument is pretty simple. It's Jokic and it's SGA. I would actually vote for Jokic, to be honest. I still think he has the belt as the most impactful guy night in and night out. Nothing against SGA. It's just Jokic has set almost an impossible bar. I respect the argument that you're trying to lay out, but people don't want to talk about who's 6th in the MVP voting.
Oh, it's a shame. I feel like in other sports we're happy to have that conversation, but maybe not. Let's get to the bounce. I'm just out here fighting the good fight, Nick. That's all.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Has Malik Beasley finally come back down to earth? He was on an insane hot streak. What you got?
Yeah, I mean, he's been on like a season-long heater, which has been very frustrating for Milwaukee Bucks fans because I think he was one of the scapegoats by the end of the year. Even though the numbers actually ended up looking pretty good for Malik Beasley, I just feel like he missed like every big wide open 3 that he had toward the end of the season and in that first round series against Indy. But no, he's been fantastic. I don't really think he's fallen off, right? I mean, maybe he just set the bar too high, which, it's Malik Beasley, so we have to be realistic. But I've just pulled his last 12 games. He's still shooting 44% from 3. He's still hitting 3.9 threes per game. He just went 4 for 6 last night against Washington. I guess he had 2 games in a row where he only had 2 3-pointers. But that says more about the new bar, I suppose, that Malik Beasley has set. So no, I don't think he's fallen off, man. If you got Malik Beasley, this has been one of the biggest hits you could possibly have in a roto league.
Anthony wants to know, should I hold on to Khalil Ware, CP3, and Miles McBride for the playoffs of the offs? Wow. You guys are so much cooler than I am. I had no idea. I've never called it the offs. I definitely will now because that just makes you sound cool. But are you Are we holding on for the offs?
That's a good question. I think, for the Jalen Brunson situation, obviously, is what you need to monitor when it comes to McBride. And they said 5 days ago that we'll get an update in 2 weeks. So basically, we're a little under a week and a half away from an update on Jalen Brunson, not a return. As long as Brunson's out, I actually really like Deuce McBride. The usage rate has definitely been there whenever Brunson's off the floor. He's taken 24 shots over the last 2 games since Brunson went down against the Lakers. So depending on how deep your league is, he's somebody I would be comfortable holding. Chris Paul, that might be a bit of a different story. Alex and I were talking about him a little bit last week, and it's really just the assists at this point. The minutes are starting to dwindle a bit for Chris Paul. He's basically averaging 25 minutes per game since the All-Star break. Obviously, De'Aaron Fox has taken over a lot of the usage for that team. He's not really a high-volume offensive player. He's not taking that many threes. So if you're in a roto league and you need the assists, hanging on to Chris Paul is fine. But if you're talking about opening up a streaming spot, he's somebody I'd probably be comfortable parting ways with.
That'll do it for us this week on the RotoWire Fantasy Basketball Podcast, the Brandon and Nick edition at least. But you can check back throughout the course of the week, a variety of episodes, 4 episodes per week. We leave no stone unturned. I've been Brandon Kravitz. He's Nick Whalen. He has rest to get, ladies and gentlemen, and we will be back next time. Enjoy the night, hoopheads.